Carla. And with that, we're very honored to have with us tonight Lieutenant Matthew Barter, who is still Chief of Staff for the Chief of the Manchester
Yes.
Police Department.
Yep.
Lieutenant and I have worked together for a while and serve on the New Hampshire Justice Bureau's Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Committee. I've just been so impressed with the work he's doing around data, gathering data and data analytics for the city of Manchester. I thought it would be very helpful to have him come to a presentation he's done before to help us understand what data is captured, what can be captured, and how that data is being used and plans for its use to help to make sure that the city remains as safe as it is and can be as safe as it can be, and give us an opportunity to also maybe make a few observations about that data gathering and analysis, and that might help to improve how it is used. So with that, I'll turn it over to the lieutenant.
Awesome. Thanks, James. Can you hear me okay? Is the audio okay?
Yes.
All right, perfect. No, appreciate you having me tonight. I did not prepare like a slideshow or anything. I hope that's okay. The last time we did this, we just kind of had an open discussion. I thought that went really well. So we'll kind of do the same here, if that's okay. And I want to keep this open. And so if there are questions and things like that, feel free to either, if you want to put it in the chat or anything like that, raise your hand. We can have a dialogue about police use of data, because I think it's a very important topic. But I think it's also one that can be a little bit misunderstood. And so I'm happy to jump into it and kind of explain how we're using data at the police department. So to begin, a little bit about me, I am a self-proclaimed data nerd. I'm very interested in the use of data, especially in policing, and how it can help inform what we do and help us do our jobs better and make the city better, and how it's used in policing generally. And so I'm involved in a lot of these conversations nationally. I'm involved with American Society of Evidence-Based Policing, which is a group really dedicated at using and implementing research into practice, so that we're doing things that are not harmful to the community, and also things that actually work in policing. And I'm also what's called a lead scholar, a law enforcement advancing data and science scholar through the National Institute of Justice, which is a collaborative of practitioners that we apply in a special program of the National Institute of Justice to really advance the concepts of research and policing. And so that's kind of where a lot of my data work is, and then certainly how we're leveraging it at the police department. So to start, a little bit about the data we collect. As a police department, we're required, as you can imagine, to write reports on incidents that we go to, and document reports of crime, reports of victimization, and the other activities that we're doing. And so there's a lot of data that we collect as we do that. We're mandated to collect a lot of that information for court purposes. That's probably where it started. But now even more so, we are collecting data that we have to report to the federal government, like the FBI, and so that there's accurate counts of crime across jurisdictions. So when you hear reports of crime going up or down or whatever it might be, those are that's all information that's collected by the state and then passed up to the FBI through the NIBRS program, the National Incident-Based Reporting System. And those are data elements that the federal government requires us to collect and report on. And then there's other data that we are collecting newly based on new initiatives going on in the space around uses of force, recruitment and retention and things like that. And a lot of that, we are incentivized to collect that data based on grant funding that we are eligible for from the federal government and from others. So that's a brief kind of overview as to why we're collecting the data that we do. But for me, I became interested because, especially as a patrol officer, and in Manchester, as you can imagine, we're very busy. We go to a lot of calls, and as a patrol officer, I found myself writing a lot of reports. And I always wondered, where does all this information go? Yeah, I'll write a long narrative about the incident I was on, but there's a lot of different boxes that I'm checking or filling out or adding data into. And so I always became interested, okay, where is that going? And how are we using it? And that's what led me down the road to really becoming interested in data and police use of data. So when I talk about what we're collecting, to give you some perspective on a normal police report that a police officer takes, our records management system has 324 possible data fields that can get filled out in those reports. So it's a lot, and it depends what type of incident it was as to how many of those fields are being filled out. Some violent crimes require certain data fields. Some different property crimes require other data fields. So it's not always consistent, but there's about 40 that we consistently fill out in each and every report. So if you want to think of things like names of the people involved, addresses, locations, certainly demographic information of the people involved, weather, if there's a child involved, things like that. Those are all data elements that we're collecting. But there's also, that's just from incident reports. There's also other kinds of data that we collect and other types of reports. So there's accident data that we collect, arrest data. That's a separate kind of, if you want to think of it as a separate form that we're filling out that we can pull data elements from and help understand what we're doing and inform what we're doing. And then there's also this concept of a call for service data versus incident data. And I'm getting into the weeds here, but it's a data conversation, so I hope that's okay. Call for service data is really when somebody calls the police department to report an incident, to report or request the services of the police. That's getting entered into a computer system, a computer-aided dispatch system, and that's how the officer gets sent to the call. But that call for service data is very limited in what it has. But it is often seen as some of the best data to use because it is the less, there is a view that it has the least amount of bias involved in it, because it's literally what the report that is being called in from the public, entered into the computer, as it was reported, the nature of the call, where the location, the date and time. So very limited, but there's not a lot of chance for that information to be changed in any way or filtered out, because the officer then responds to that call. So I'm going to give you an example. Somebody has a burglary that happens at their home. They call the police to report the burglary. That initial phone call gets logged into the computer and a police officer gets sent. Once the police officer is there, they're going to start their investigation, and they are then going to write an incident report after that. Well, a lot of things can happen from the time that the police officer gets notified and sent to the call from the dispatch system to the time they actually start writing their incident report. And so that gap, there's a lot of, judgment that goes into what the officer is going to do. And that's where we can see issues sometimes of bias come up, or you see some gaps in reporting. So what was reported as a burglary, maybe it could, and I'm not saying this happens, but it could get changed to a theft, which is different classification of crime and different severity of a crime. It could not get reported at all. Maybe the police officer goes and talks to the person, and the person ends up deciding not to file an official police report. And so we never collect that statistic of a burglary having occurred at a certain place at a certain time. But what we still have is the call for service record. So there's differences in the data that we collect and how, how good it is, quote unquote, how reliable it is, and what types of information it gives us. So there's a lot of nuance in what we're looking at and how we're looking at it. So when you hear about reports of crime or reports of incidents and their statistics around what the police are doing, it's good to consider, maybe have that thought as to, okay, what types of data are they using to come up with this conclusion here? Because it does get somewhat nuanced. So that's the different types of data we collect. And I'm going to dive into first kind of what are some of the issues that come up with police data. This is something I spend a lot of time on. I was just at some sessions last week at a conference around this topic of police use of data and how it's viewed, and how to make sure that we are using data in the best ways possible. So one thing that comes up often is that there's an argument that police data is inherently biased because of disproportionate contacts between the police and minority communities. And so there is some legitimacy to that argument. I'll go into why that happens. But that is one argument, that no police data is good because it's all bias. I go to great lengths with our use of data to make sure that we are using the kind of the best information possible to guide what we are doing. But that is one argument that comes up. And the reason that happens is because the police, really, we only have contact with a small proportion of the community. So that small proportion of the community is going to be overrepresented in the data, because we know through a lot of research that a very small proportion of any community is going to make up a large percentage of the calls that the police are dealing with. And that's been replicated across communities and across studies throughout the country. So that's an important thing to know and understand. The other issue with police data is that we can generate our own data through our proactive activity. And so when I think of these calls and how we classify some of these reports and calls, is there's proactive police work on one side. So that's going to be things like your motor vehicle stops or your pedestrian stops, the things that a police officer is making a decision to do some type of police work that generates a statistic. So that's proactive work. And then on the other side, there's reactive police incidents. And that's when a member of the community calls the police to report an incident, and we then respond to it. Those are two very different things. And it's important for us to understand what type of data we're using, which one of those we're using when we look at doing different types of analysis. So the problem that becomes with proactive police data, so things like car stops or any incident that started with a police officer generating that call, that is the type of information that can lead to certain types of bias involved. So if there is bias policing going on, where certain groups are targeted, or anything like that, and to be frank, we know that has happened in our history in policing, right? No, I'm not saying that that doesn't happen. We know that has happened in policing, and that's where that information will come. That's where that data will show and that bias will show, because it's a police officer making a decision as to what to do. And if there's discrimination or anything like that going on, that's where you're going to see it in that type of data. Somewhat, so there's some other nuance there, but that's an important part of proactive. On the other hand, with reactive data, that's just the police responding to people that are calling us. And so when somebody calls and is requesting police service, we are going to go to that call. And so we need to separate those things to understand the impacts of policing and things like bias-based policing and whatnot. The other component that we need to think about and some issues with police data is what we call feedback loops. And so this is what's gotten some police departments into trouble, is they start using some of that proactive data and sometimes arrest data to feed into an algorithm or to influence, to be the main data set that's used in analysis that's done to, we'll say, identify top offenders or people most at risk for committing crime. Those are some of the things that are done with police data. Well, if you're using that proactive data, you're using arrest data, well, what it's doing is it keeps feeding that same information that could be biased into whatever algorithm or analysis is being done, and it can perpetuate that cycle that's going on. So it's important for us to understand that and identify it and use the right types of data in policing. with that, when we look at the Manchester Police Department, our use of data, we really do focus on those reactive calls for service, and we parse those out into proactive and reactive calls, so we can see exactly what we're dealing with, and we try to use that reactive data to understand truly what's going on in the community, and also to inform our responses to crime and crime prevention and things like that. Because we know that if we use some of that other data, it can create those feedback loops that we don't want, because we want a true sense of what's going on in the community. And I'm just making sure I'm hitting all the things on my notes here. So that's the big kind of conversation about data. Hopefully that was provides some insight as to what types of data we want to use in policing, and what becomes most valuable. So it's that call for service data is very valuable to us, and then the reactive incident data, the ones where the community is calling us, asking the police to respond. So before I kind of switch gears into what we're doing in Manchester, any questions on that or clarifications, comments? Yeah, I didn't see names here. Is it Donna?
Sorry, I was on mute. Sorry, Donna Brown. You talked about the, I don't know what the word was, the basis or the incentivized connection between grant money, and I'm assuming it's federal grant money. What I'm interested in is the data that you have to report back. Does that include, because my understanding is you have to say, okay, you gave us all this money, federal government, here's what we did with it. I mean, basically that's a shorthand of that. So in terms of the data, do you have to say we made X amounts of arrests, and of those cases we arrested, we got X amount of convictions, and of those convictions, this amount of people went to jail, and this amount of people went to jail for this long? Is that is that part of the data that you're reporting back to for the federal grants?
No. So actually, and I'm glad you asked this question. So on the grant stuff, no, it's actually just to apply for a grant, to be eligible. What we're seeing is we have to be enrolled in these programs, that we are reporting our crime data, and that we are reporting our use of force data, as well as things like death in custody data and things like that. So just those kind of administrative data sets, there are programs that the federal government has that they want all police departments to report to. Not all police departments are doing it, because there's a lot of technological issues and hurdles to get over there, but they have these reporting systems. So like the FBI stood up the use of force reporting system, which is new, and so we're all trying to report appropriately to that. But the federal government, the grant givers, they want to see that we are participating in those programs. President Biden said we want to collect. We don't have this data. We want this data nationally, and so that's how they're incentivizing us to participate in these programs. Because at the end of the day, no police department has to give their data. There's no requirement to do so. What is if you want access to any of these federal funds and grants and things like that, you have to be submitting data to it. Because nationally, if we don't have our police departments, cohesively reporting similar data elements, we're never going to know the scope of issues and problems that are going on. And so that's why they do that. On the back end, though, yes, when we have to report back on what we are using federal funds for, and we provide that in reports, it all depends what the initiative is. I can tell you when I started, a lot of those funds, yes, the outcome measures were things like arrests and enforcement activity. Very difficult, though, to get to who was actually convicted and if there was incarceration, because our data system doesn't track that far. That kind of goes into the courts. And so we have this disjointed data that doesn't line up, and it gets really messy and tough. And so we know, like, that point of arrest and enforcement action that was taken. But as we look at programs that work and evidence-based policing, those outcome measures are so important, because we know that enforcement, I think that there is a component for enforcement in what we're doing and making and trying to make sure communities are safe, but that's not the main thing, and nor is it the only thing. So what we're doing a lot now is using our outcome measures that we're that we're collecting, and B, that we're reporting back, are more things like positive community contacts, and I'll get into that in a minute, are more things like number of hours spent in the community, measures like that, how much crime actually went down, not using the metric of arrests and enforcement as that success measure. It's no, crime went down this much, we had this many community contacts, we did this many community events, things like that. That's definitely the way that we're going. And I'll get into that a little bit more with how we're using data in a minute, because a lot of it is grant funded work that we're able to do. I think there are a couple other questions. Kathy, did you have a question?
Yeah, I sort of understand this is all, of course, new, and when you talk about data and stuff, my head goes, but I was wondering if you could make up an incident that would, saying, okay, a call comes in and says, just got home and I think somebody got into the house and blah, blah, blah. So you send an officer. And what happens, if someone's just making that call, and then I'm thinking about bias, and by the time the police officer gets there, the person is already talking about, Black people are the streets, 5 streets over. Are those the kinds of things that are reported so that you can, or if a police officer suggest, I don't know. I'm a little bit lost, but that's okay.
Yeah, no, I think I understand a little bit what you're saying. So what can happen in between that call and kind of the incident report being, there's a lot that can happen. So one is, sometimes we have victims that want to jump to conclusions, and there could be their bias that creeps in there, and they might suspect people having no evidence to suspect it, and we see that. We see that a lot with getting calls about like suspicious people in neighborhoods, and oftentimes it's minorities that they're calling on, and there's nothing else, that says they're suspicious, but yet our officers get sent there and have to kind of navigate through that. And so that's definitely a phenomenon that happens. But also, if we had, or any police department has a biased police officer, right, and they go to that call, we'll say it's the victim is somebody from minority community that's the victim of that crime, and say you have a biased police officer that responds to that, and they don't take it serious, and maybe they try to talk that victim out of making the report of the crime. Well, now we never have that information that a crime happened and that person was victimized at a certain place at a certain time, which then helps us understand where we deploy resources, where we do crime prevention work, things like that. And so if we don't have the information, well, then we're not going to that neighborhood and helping that neighborhood. And that becomes kind of difficult. So that's where some of that bias creeps in. Hopefully that or could creep in. Let me say that. I'm not saying this happens all the time. It's things we need to be thinking about as we're evaluating the data. So hopefully that helps.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Tim, I see you had your hand raised up there.
Yeah, hopefully this is a simple one. So you were talking about how in contacts with the public, you record the demographics of the people involved. And so are those basically from the US census categories of demographics?
So the FBI has these, it's the National Incident Based Reporting System, NIBRS. There's a book, that's too thick, that has all the data, lists all the data elements and breaks them out and what those code categories need to be. So they break it up into race and ethnicity. I am hopeful that they get a little bit more with the times. I think the census has changed how they're capturing demographic information. I can tell you the race and ethnicity, having it two separate categories, gets very confusing and can be difficult for us to classify. And so recently, when we did a big analysis on gun violence in the city, we had to do a lot of work to try to understand the impact of gun violence on minority communities, specifically because it got a little messy when we were breaking out into just, race and then just ethnicity, because there's overlap that occurs in those things. So, yep.
Yeah. So that's actually kind of connecting to what another thing I was going to ask related to that, which maybe this should wait till you talk about Manchester specifically. But one of the things that's been in the news about has been that in some parts of the country, it has appeared, because of that separation of race and ethnicity, there are some departments where when they have contact with a Latino person, they always categorize the Latino person as white. So like to avoid negative, statistics for dealing with people of color. So I was wondering how you like what kind of measures in Manchester you can do to kind of avoid that sort of thing happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see that we can see that happen as well, because the person is light skinned. We'll say that it's a light skinned Hispanic individual. They might likely would get classified under the race category as white, but it's that ethnicity category that we're relying on our officers to select, Hispanic under that. So that's how we're kind of making sure that we're gathering the right information. But at the end of the day, right, it comes down to the information getting entered correctly. That's, I think, in any field challenging, but ours is as well. What we do, though, is in our records management system, master name files are created. So each individual person has a master record in the system. And so if that changes, if race ethnicity shouldn't be changing on that master name file. And so we have some measures in place to be able to try to understand that better.
Thanks.
I think this is a really good point to point out that this very question of capturing that race and ethnicity information is a huge issue that we've talked about, and there's legislation that we've been trying to pass at the state level to help be able to more accurately gather that information. And the challenge is that some people don't want to reveal that, right? Some people don't want to say what their race or ethnicity is because they're afraid it's going to somehow negatively impact, and I should say somehow, it could negatively impact how they're treated. So the accuracy of that race and ethnicity information is a subject of major debate, and I know the lieutenant can say more than I can. That very topic.
Yeah, and I was actually going to bring this up, so good point. And Anne-Marie and Tracy, I'll come back to you right after this point. And this is Matt Barter speaking, so I can't necessarily speak for the Manchester Police Department on this because I'm not sure is the exact kind of where the department stands. But from where I sit, not having race ethnicity data on an individual's driver's license is really tough for us to have a full understanding of any disproportionate impacts or disparity between the police and the community in New Hampshire. Because one of the things that happens really on every single police call that a police officer goes to, whether or not they write a report at the end of the day, they are usually checking the person's name with our dispatchers, with our dispatch system, where they're checking a name to see if somebody is missing, if there's bail conditions involved, if they have warrants, things like that. It is just common practice among on any call you go to that those names get run. And so if we had, I think the race from where I sit, if we had race ethnicity data, we would be able to understand through that data set what the contacts between the police and the community really are. We'd have a much better understanding of that, which then helps us peel back the layers to understand what's going on. If there's disparity, if there's bias going on, if there's anything like that, and we can try to get in front of that. So to me, it's a negative that we don't have it. I understand certainly the other side of that argument, but it's difficult for us to have a true understanding of demographics and those contexts without it. So, Anne-Marie and Tracy, I saw you had your hand up there.
Hi, this is Tracy. And question on this. Do you have a means of gathering information about the officers and what they're going through? I worked in mental health for years and had a number of cops as clients, and listening to the stories of what they had to face on some of the calls, traffic calls with fatalities, or domestic violence, any number of things, and also situations like lack of sleep, how many of those calls they might have had. I don't know if there's any way of, well, it would be dependent on if you can gather the information. I guess I'm thinking in terms of officer health, and then also how the officer responds to these situations, because you put enough of that stress on an officer, and one, you can wind up with PTSD, and it only takes one awful enough incident for that. But the other thing is just the level of stress and how the officer will then react later on if there's not some sort of intervention to help the officer.
Yep. So, yeah, it's a big conversation. It's one of Chief Allenberg's top priorities is officer mental health and wellness, because if we don't have good employees, right, if we don't have good officers on the street, there's going to be then healthy officers on the street. That's when a lot of bad things happen. And so, yeah, we are thinking about that a lot. And we actually started, so we do a 40-hour in-service training week for our officers. Every officer goes through a 40-hour in-service training week every year. And a portion of that, a day, is spent on mental health and wellness for the officers. And so what we started doing this year was every officer is completing a standardized assessment tool called, I believe it's called the ProQual 5. It's a standardized tool to assess stress and burnout, and it's anonymized for them, or only clinicians see it. But that's really going to give us a good sense as to, I guess, as an organization where we're at, but also where individuals are over time, so that we can understand if there are impacts over time. I wish we could, assess that every day. It's just not possible at this point to do that, but we're at least getting a point in time indicators as to where our folks are at. And so to me, it's a start, and not many police departments are doing that level of kind of data collection to understand, one, how their people are doing, two, if the programming that we're doing is being impactful. Because this is now probably this is the third year that we've started, that we've been doing this type of directed officer mental health and wellness programming. And so now we're hopefully seeing if our programming has worked. The other thing is there's some innovative studies going on. Some of my colleagues across the country are doing some pretty cool stuff where they're using medical grade, almost like a medical grade Fitbit that officers are wearing. And they're wearing it for, I can't remember the study period, if it was a month or 90 days. But they're tracking those officers and what their physical health is. And then they're matching it up too with the calls for service. So they're matching up, what heart rates and things like that are during calls for service, that's particularly stressful calls for service. And they're using that data to help inform, how their officers are doing and when they can, get some early intervention in there. And so those are, that's some of the cool stuff that's going on. I hope to see that continue to expand and kind of become a thing in policing, that we can really identify early on an officer that might need some help. There's some things that we've been doing for a very long time called an early warning system, or an early intervention system, some folks call it, where we look at some metrics to understand if something's going on with an officer. So we look at things like number of uses of force, number of accidents they've been in, number of pursuits they've been in, complaints that they've received. And so there's kind of a matrix there that we'll look at and identify officers that might be in need of intervention. My personal opinion on it is it's okay, but it doesn't do a lot. And honestly, if someone's showing up on that list, that's probably been an issue for a while. And so we're trying to understand ways that we can identify whether it's a problematic officer or an officer that's in need of some help way early on, because that's where we're going to prevent a lot of things. But yeah, that's a absolutely great question, and something that I'm hopeful. I like what we're doing now. I think we're moving in a good direction, and I want to see expand. Yeah.
Do you also keep track of officers' shift schedules and how that might affect their sleep schedule? Because that
I mean, we know our officers, on midnights are probably chronically fatigued. Kind of the nature of it. Yeah. So, but officers do move around they have the opportunity to move to a different shift once every 4 months. And so it's a lot to track, but it brings up a good point as to how that could, play into the equation.
Well, one of the things I think about both in Manchester, but so many police departments are so understaffed that officers are taking on extra shifts. So they might be doing, a double, or they might be doing nights for 3 days, and then they have to do a couple of days. So their sleep is just so awful. It's just so off that they feel awful.
Yep. No, it's very true. Very true. But I think that is one of the metrics, especially we call it, an officer will get forced, so they'll have to work a double. Those things are things we need to track probably better, to be honest with you.
Yeah. And then I also think about officers I've talked to who've done nights, and then they either have to go in for a meeting the next day so they don't get sleep, or they have to go to court.
Yep.
Get sleep, and they have to show up for their shift that night too. So.
Yep. Yeah, and you have to imagine, right? As this has happened to me, where I've worked a double, and it's now 6 a.m. I haven't slept in really probably 24 hours. And I go to a call with an individual threatening somebody with a knife, and now I have to make a decision, as to what, that could have a really bad outcome. And I'm doing that on 24 hours, of being awake. It's, those are real things. Yeah. Good segue to kind of the other discussions of how we're using data in Manchester. And so I'll hit on those, and, the last little bit that we have here. So I'm very much interested in the crime reduction and crime prevention space, particularly when it comes to violent crime and gun violence. That's where most of my work is. I'm very excited to say I'm starting a Doctor of Public Health degree at Johns Hopkins University in the study of gun violence. And so really looking at how data can help inform this question of gun violence, specifically urban gun violence, and get a kind of this prevention angle, get upstream on those efforts. And so in that work, one of the big things we focus on in Manchester is where this gun violence is clustering in the city, and they're called hotspots. And hotspots policing is probably the most researched concept in policing. Well over 100 studies on the efficacy of hotspots policing, this concept that crime clusters at certain places, and generally very small micro areas. And then the interventions that can be effective in those spaces. So one way that you could provide an intervention on a hotspot area is what we would refer to as a crackdown, where the police go in and it's zero tolerance, and everyone's getting stopped, everyone's getting a ticket or arrested or a pat down or something like that. Through the research, we know that's not effective. You might have a very short period of crime reduction if you do a crackdown. But we also know from the research that is very harmful on the community, especially the residents, the folks that live in those neighborhoods and live in those hotspots. And it really causes a lot of problems for that kind of takes down police legitimacy and loses trust and faith in the police. And so it's actually a lot worse, that type of tactic. What we've focused on with hotspots policing is really increasing police presence in spaces. And we call that guardianship because it's based on a theory, well-known theory in criminology, this routine activities theory, which says crime clusters at a place when three forces converge, and those three forces are motivated offenders, suitable victims, and what we call a lack of capable guardianship. And so the capable guardianship piece is, it could be police, but it's also neighborhoods looking out for one another and neighbors looking out for one another, and really not allowing for crime and deviance to occur there, because they are kind of working as one, and they're being guardians of their space. And so the theory is, and what the research has shown is, if we can infuse police officers as those capable guardians, trusted, legitimate police officers, it can have profound crime reduction impacts. And the research is clear on that. So in Manchester, what we are doing and what we've been doing, we're using ARPA funds and some other Project Safe Neighborhoods funding to support this, is this idea of hotspot patrols, and specifically foot patrols in these areas where gun violence clusters. And when we talked a little bit before about incentivizing the data that we're collecting, and I'd said in the past how these types of programs in the past, the outcome, the incentive for the police officer would be to make more arrests. Well, that's not what we're doing. We're now in I think we're going into our second full summer of deploying these foot patrols. And the incentive and what the officers have to collect for data as they're doing these patrols, and what they kind of grade the patrols on, is number of positive police contacts. And so what we encourage our officers to do is, and this is why we love foot patrols, because in a car, you can drive by somebody. Even on a bicycle, you can kind of ride by somebody and not have to engage, right? Meaning like somebody just walking on the street, or maybe kids playing in the park. But if you're walking, very difficult to pass by somebody and not have a hello or have some type of positive engagement, have a conversation. And so we have our officers collect the number of positive engagements that they've had with people, and that's the key number that we're tracking. And so that's been really helpful. We're not even tracking number of arrests and hotspots that our officers are seeing, or that we're kind of displaying publicly. We are, of course, tracking it to understand if we are having any type of disproportionate arrests in these hotspots, because it's important to know, right? We want to know if there's an issue. But what we are projecting and showing as the outcome measures are these positive police community contacts, number of hours actually being in those spaces on foot, being visible, talking to people, and then, is crime going up or down in that hotspot? Because at the end of the day, that's the ultimate outcome. Is it becoming safe? Is that neighborhood becoming safer because the police there, or is there no impact at all? And what we tell our officers, as I kind of communicate and talk to the officers about the program and what their expectations are, the whole idea is, if there's a crime, we'll say, and these are specific towards gun violence. So if there's a shooting that occurs in a hotspot while they are on a patrol, well, then they've failed at what they've done, at their effort for the day. They have failed in what they were supposed to be doing out there. Conversely, if nothing is going on crime-wise and there's no disorder and it's quote unquote quiet while they're doing their foot patrol, that's a win. That is success. And that's what I'm trying to communicate. And it can be a little bit tougher with some of the younger officers, right? Some of the younger officers want to get out there, and they, as I say, they want to catch bad guys. And right, we need officers like that, but in certain circumstances. But it's not for, it doesn't mean you do that all the time. And actually, if there's nothing going on, well, that means that your presence is doing what it should, and that it's deterring would-be offenders from committing crime. And so that's the big project that we're doing with them, and I'm really happy with how that's going. We're seeing success, specifically around the reduction of gun violence. If you go onto our website and our annual report, it talks a little bit more about some of the reductions we've seen in the hotspot areas specifically. So that's been really exciting. I think something good, and we're doing good work with. The other thing that we're doing with data, and I know we're coming up towards 8 o'clock, so I'll be brief on this and open up to questions again, is using our data to really help inform outreach efforts that we're doing. So one of the things with our gun violence reduction strategy that we developed with community members last year was this notion that we had youth numbers were really driving gun violence in the city, both as suspects but also as victims and being otherwise involved. Was a big youth component. But a gap was we didn't have really great outreach efforts to connect with these kids and hopefully divert them from being involved in gun violence. And so we partnered with a group called My Turn in the city and developed this project called Project Connect, where they are able to do direct outreach to youth who are involved in gun violence, whether as victims, as offenders, whatever it might be, and try to connect them with services, getting their high set, their GED, getting into work development programs, financial literacy programs, a lot of really good work they're doing. So we developed that program, but we're using data to inform who we're really targeting for outreach. And not to get super detailed, but we do a process that's called social network analysis. Quick definition, it has nothing to do with social media. It's all about an individual's social network that we're able to look at the crimes that occurred, specifically gun crimes that occurred, and who was at multiple different gun crime incidents, and who their kind of peers are or other associates. And through this specific analysis, we can look at who's really involved in gun violence in the city. It's a very, very small proportion. But we took those names of like the ones that were kind of the biggest influencers, we called them, in gun violence, the ones connecting multiple different events together. And we brought them to Project Connect and say, these are the kids that we really need outreach directed towards. And Project Connect took it and ran with it. And it's been a great relationship. So not only have they gotten, I think they got 9 out of the 11 influencers into the Project Connect program. And those kids are working through different services, whether it's degrees or jobs, things like that, stuff to keep them out of trouble, essentially. So they were able to make a lot of good contacts. But the other thing is we saw some really significant results where we saw victimization of folks in that group go down to 0, whereas before the rate of victimization within that group was like at least once a month, someone in that group was becoming the victim of a crime. We saw contacts with the police drop in that group, as well as their peer group, their associates that they're connected to them. And we saw overall any involvement in gun crimes go down within not only the specific group we targeted, but also their associates. And so it was a pilot project, but our initial results are really encouraging. And we're trying to replicate that now and keep that type of outreach going. But just another way how we're using data to help inform a response. And for me, it's really how can we inform preventative responses? How can we get upstream? And how can we use our police data to help inform our different partners, and especially in social services and human services, so they can do their jobs better. And so I won't go into it too much, but we're doing something very similar with overdoses. We have very detailed data on overdoses, and we share that data almost daily with our partners at Public Health and our outreach teams to help inform the work that they are doing. So that was a lot. I apologize. I could talk about this for days on end. I want to keep the last minutes available for questions. I see a couple hands going up here. James, do you want to regulate the questions? I've seen like 4 go up and I can't see the whole screen anymore.
Well, if I could have Tim do that, because I'm in the car on the road.
Oh, sorry.
I can see the whole screen.
If people want to raise their hand, I think I can look over every once in a while and see, but Tim, if you could do that, because you're probably sitting on a computer.
Yeah. So I think Carol raised her hand first, I believe.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. My question, I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but I'm very interested in the data informing, finding the hot spots and then trying to improve the situation in those places. You said you're concentrating on gun violence, and it seems like we frequently hear about some incident of gun violence, or at least, bullets flying or whatever. What happens after those? How does that fit into whether that's a kind of a one-off, or if it becomes a hotspot, or how do you determine with data, where the trends are going? Thank you.
So what we have gone to is very much it's retrospective look, and we look at 3 years worth of data to identify our hotspots. And we're really doing a reanalysis only once a year because, and frankly, these spots that we're focusing on, these have been chronic hotspots for a long time. They have persisted. So even officers a generation before me probably could have picked these off the map as well. But this is data informing, exactly where we're going. And so we did see a little bit of change when we did reanalysis this year, but it's a lot of the similar kind of chronic spots that we are still continuing to focus on, and they're in neighborhoods that frankly have a lot of need to them. And that's why, and part of our whole process I didn't get into is some other focus, whether it's around environments, around community building, things like that within those spaces. But yeah, we look at a pretty large swath of data. So one incident isn't going to shape it. And then briefly, if there is an incident within a hotspot, what we look at is it gang or group related? So is it some type of retaliatory violence or motivated by a group, a criminal group? Or was it a domestic situation, or was it something else? And that's going to help us navigate what we're going to, what a response might look like if there needs to be a response. All right, I think I can see some hands now on my screen here. Go ahead.
Well, yeah. So I think it's Anne Marie and Tracy.
Anne Marie said it's me again. Actually, congratulations on going for your DPH. Good for you.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I'm excited.
And the program for the hotspots working with the kids sounds great. Glad to hear that. That's give them hope, and there's a lot less chance for violence. I wonder about the program with the officers going out, and you're getting their reports of positive contact. Do you have some sort of follow-up with members of the community in a sense of how that's affecting community trust?
Yeah, not exactly, and we need to. Community surveys are really difficult. Actually, the director of National Institute of Justice just last week put out a call for innovative ways to gather community feedback, because we know that doing a good systematic survey in a neighborhood can be really challenging. And so I think hopefully there's gonna be a lot of smart people coming up with ideas on that. We did institute a system. It doesn't relate directly to the hotspots, but it's a way to try to get some feedback from the community where certain calls, the caller will get a text message survey from us. It's very similar to how you would from Comcast or utility company if they come do service. And so it's a quick 4-question survey about how the call taker was, how the officer treated them, and any other feedback. But kind of open narrative. And so we have that system in place to get feedback, to understand kind of what the temperature is. The problem with it is the system doesn't necessarily narrow to like a specific hotspot. We could probably go back with the data and figure it out, but right now we don't have that. It is something that we need to do.
But since I serve on the health committee, one of our challenges always is finding out what's going on in the community health-wise, and getting direct feedback from folks. And also the challenge of all the different languages that Manchester has. And I did, and I guess the other thing is with the surveys, because they're so often just in English. We've tried some. We also try to just have direct community conversations with people to hear from them about their concerns. But also, one of the questions we ask about health is, who do you trust?
Yep.
And I think it's great that you're doing the programs, and it would be great that you can show that trust in police makes such a difference.
Yeah, and actually, you actually sparked an idea with me. As we have our FAST team in Manchester, the public health and safety team with the health department, I think they speak 14 different languages. They're
Right.
designed to be in these spaces, and we're trying to leverage their ability of the community health worker more in these spaces. And that might be a great opportunity to use that resource to maybe get some feedback.
And that's where we've had luck, like when we were doing
Yeah.
vaccine equity work, was people going into people's homes,
Yeah.
offering them information about vaccines, but also just asking them a couple of questions and getting that direct feedback. So it wasn't in the form of a survey necessarily. Sometimes it was, but also just talking to them.
Yeah.
Hearing stories.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It sparked a new thought here. I appreciate that.
So Matt, I wonder if I could just break in for a minute. Could a way to get this community feedback be for us or for some group to hold a monthly meeting where you could do reporting? And I know we try to do some of this in the CAB meetings, but CAB meetings have so many other things going on. I'm wondering if it would be valuable to just allocate a chunk of time every month to let you report on that hotspot data and get community feedback and bring people in specifically for that.
Yeah, and do you think you would be able to, I guess, help? Because sometimes we have trouble getting the right people in the room, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so if we could get assistance with that, that would be huge. And I think there's a definite good opportunity there.
Well, there's any.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Tracy.
Oh, I was saying for you to go ahead. I'm just thinking in terms of the number of different groups that are socially involved in Manchester, whether it's GSOP and Central Latino with the Latino groups, or Victory Women of Vision, or Manchester Community Action Coalition. There's any number of groups that are very much involved in the community, and with different ethnic groups. So I think that'd be one of the places to start.
Yeah, this feels like a law enforcement criminal justice committee action, Donna. Just one more thing to add to that crew.
Sorry, definitely. Yeah, we should connect on this more. I'm sure, James, you have the officer's contact information, and we can do that and follow up after this.
Yep,
that would be
definitely.
Great. Yeah, let's do that, because that would be fantastic if we can get that off the ground.
Yeah, that's great.
All right, and Tim, I think you've been waiting patiently.
Yeah, I've just got one more demographic question, which kind of relates to the social services stuff you were asking about or mentioning. So, so a lot of the younger people I work with are transgender or non-binary people, and so studies seem to show that people in those groups are victims of violence and other crimes at a much greater rate, sometimes like half a dozen times more than the people in the same demographics otherwise. And so, of course, that's like evaluating that accurately is you need good statistics. So when you guys record the gender, how are you handling the sort of the new gender demographics of the 21st century?
Yeah, unfortunately, right now we are still using what those NIBR required data elements are, and it hasn't caught up for us. Although I will go back and check, because sometimes it doesn't get pushed down to us. And what happens is so I could create a new code category under gender. As just whatever the right definition would be, and we would work with our community partners to make sure we classify that right. But what would happen is if we selected that and then submitted that data to the state, which we have to do, it would get rejected back to us because it didn't conform to what the requirements were, and so there's catching up that needs to happen, and it's not there yet. I think that one will be there be incorporated very soon, but it's not there yet, and so that is a challenge that we have, and it's an area of dark data that we don't have good information on, and we need to.
So is that just the state catching up, or is it at the federal level too?
Yeah, I should explain that more. So it's we report to the state, and then the state sends everything to the federal government. So it's based on those federal government requirements, and so the state just aligns directly with what the feds say require.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So I think any other questions?
I just have a brief one as a follow-up
Yeah.
to Donna. Small world, ironic. I was just on a listserv before I came on here with some other criminal defense attorneys talking about gang validation tools and the problems with them. And I was actually just sharing a brief. I had a legal brief on some of the problems, a lot of them being racial bias involved in some of the gang validation tools. So is that something that you guys are working on, or is that a concern? Or
so definitely concern. We had in our old system, it wasn't a good database, but there was a database. We had since gotten rid of that and made that defunct because of those issues, because of due process issues. Essentially, historically, if you were on a gang list, there was no due process to get off that list, and it was just at the whim of what the police or the officer or detective said, right? And that's the challenge. So we got rid of it. Right now, how we approach gang validations is really on a case-by-case basis if the prosecutor requests it, right? So if the case itself has indications of being gang-related, they will ask an investigator, and one of our investigators who's expert in gangs will do a validation based on that. And so the validation is based off scoring criteria that's been developed through both our criminal statute. So we use both the state criminal statute that defines what a gang member is, as well as the FBI guidelines for that. But it's we don't have a database on it, and we just do individual validations for individual cases if it's a criteria for that case.
thank you.
Yes. But I will say that's another thing we can connect on further, Donna, because I think there's some importance there, but there needs to be the appropriate due process and safeguards there as well.
No, love to follow up on that. Thank you.
Yeah.
So with this complex issue, I'm hoping that we've been able to have a little more definition to the challenges and a little more understanding of what the PD is doing with Lieutenant actually leading the charge. And as you can see, as I said at the very beginning, I'm just so amazed and appreciative of all the work that the Lieutenant's done and that the department has done to try to gather the data. I think the strategies are in the right place and going in the right direction. And they're going to be times when bias creeps in and the challenges happen, and we can't make it 100% bias free and perfect, but I think we're so headed in the right direction, and we've got some good capable hands leading the charge. And I think one of the things I wanted to mention is we do have, and I think I may have mentioned this, we have the community action board, the CAB meetings, where the community has an opportunity to see some of what is going on behind the scenes, some of which Matt's been sharing with us. And we need to encourage people to attend those meetings if they can. And then I think we do have the opportunity to create more space for this kind of interaction to take place. So encourage folks to let people know